Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be a part 2 of the hooking up with identity server authentication, where we're going to take our Nuxtjs client and connect to our identity server, get our access tokens and ID tokens, etc. So let's go ahead and grab a package. Specifically, we are going to be using the oidc-client library. Link is in the description. Go ahead and grab it. Primarily, I'm going to be using it to go over some of the commands and some of the configuration that we need to grab. I don't always remember this stuff. This is kind of the category of set up once and forget about it. So, I mean, here it goes, right? Let's go ahead and we want to install the library. So I don't have my application running. I'm going to go ahead, paste it here. And obviously I have uninstalled Node from my WSL side, so I have to actually go into cmd.exe. So once this is installed, I'll get back to you. Okay, so here we are. Let's go ahead, actually just do npm run dev. So we will start up the application and then we can work through actually setting this thing up, right? So our package.json, if we open this up, it should now include oidc-client, right? So that's good. What we want to do now is let's go ahead into our pages, into the index view page. And what we're going to do here is we're going to try to do minimal setup example and then move stuff to the store, okay? So make a div and make a button. Button, as I remember, Viewify, login, and on click, let's allow the login to happen, right? So we actually need these this method. So methods, login, and when we click, we want to log in, right? Well, what do we actually need to log in? Well, let's go into the oidc client and here you can read through the documentation. The particular page that I'm interested in is the wiki. And on the wiki, it basically tells you more or less how to use it, what's required, etc. So primarily what we want to be grabbing is the user manager. And I think if you're interested, all the way at the bottom, yep. So you have samples using it in different frameworks. Surprised the Nuxtjs is not there. So you have like stuff like Quasar, Vue.js, Vue.ux, right? You got all the good stuff. So starting from the top, let's go ahead and grab our user manager. And these are the first required settings that we need to pass to the user manager. So what I will do is I will create data where we can actually instantiate our user manager. So user manager, and we'll start with null. And the thing is that we have a server side and the client side. So oidc-client is for the client side only. So all of our operations that we're doing with the user manager should be on the client side, okay? So basically, I will do all the instantiation in the created clause, where I will make sure that I'm going to check the process server, that we're not on the server, and then we're going to go through this. So let's get rid of this import that got its way in somehow. And what we want to do is we want to import a deconstruct from oidc-client, right? And I think if you have 12, you can see a bunch of stuff in here, and you can scroll through this, and you can, you know, have a look around. But primarily, what we're after is the user manager, okay? And the way we instantiate the user manager is we go to this user manager and we say new user manager, okay? And for this new user manager, again, we can press F12 if we really want to, and we can take a look at the constructor where the user manager setting is basically what we can specify, okay? So here are the bunch of settings, and if we actually take a look at the user manager settings, extends oidc-client settings, there will be an option here for user store, which is just another object with the web storage. So we'll cover this in terms of where do we actually want to store our token, okay? So it's just a little bit of foreshadowing. But nevertheless, what options do we actually need to fill out? well, follow the documentation, right? So required settings, authority, who is our provider, where does he live? Our provider lives on the port 5000. So let's go ahead and specify the authority for HTTP, localhost 5000, right? So we are going to be using HTTP for this, so we might encounter some issues where it's configured to work with HTTPS, but we actually want HTTP. Okay, so next setting, client ID. Okay, so let's pop this here. What client ID did we actually add? So let's grab the startup, take a look at the client that we have configured. So client ID has web client. Let's go ahead and grab this client ID and we put it here. Next thing is the redirect URI. So the redirect URI of your client application to receive a response from the OIDC Auth2 provider, right? So, I mean, we configured this as well. This is most of the stuff that we can grab from here. So redirect URI, I mean, that's pretty much it. Again, this sort of stuff, this configuration here, we're going to move it to the store, and most of the stuff that is going to get populated is going to be from this .env environment, right? Because the URLs are going to be different depending on our development and production environment, okay? So next thing is the response type. So the default is ID token, but what we actually want is to set this to code, okay? Because we have basically enabling PKCE for implicit flow allows us to actually use the grant type of code, okay? So we specify code here because we're going to get back a code, which we can then exchange for the token. And again, we'll take a look at how this happens. And then the scope, right? So what scope can we grab? Let's go ahead, and I can never remember. It's a string. Okay, so we have a string, and we will have the open ID here, and then we will have the profile as well. So for our startup, we have the open ID and profile specs scopes specified here. We actually need to tell the client configuration that this client is allowed to grab those scopes. So on here, let's go ahead and specify allowed scopes. So this is going to be a list of strings, and identity server actually has, let's see, identity server constants. So there we go. And I think standard scopes and open ID. We want to copy this and add profile. So this is just to basically say this client right here can grab the open ID and the profile scopes that are sort of defined as the identity resources. Okay, so again, as I explained in the previous video, scope is kind of the area of and resources the data. Scope is the area. Which areas are we allowing this client to even access? Okay, so for us, it's going to be the open ID area of the user, which is its authentication, and profile, which is its kind of personal data. Okay, so we're allowed to do these things. Let's go ahead and check if we need, anything else. Some other stuff that I think we don't need. Optional authorization request settings. Looks good to me. Otherwise, optional settings clock skew, load user info. So I think this is important to just kind of set this to true here, and I will uncomment it because I don't want to forget it, but I want to show what the difference will be between the two. Post logout redirect URI, this is definitely something that we should have. I will include it here, and the URI that it should be containing is of our application. And again, we're just going to put it at the slash here. Should be fine. Pop-up redirect URI, none of this really matters. Another important thing is a silent redirect URI. So we will cover that. So for now, I'm just going to put this here. But what I will do is I'll comment it out because we are not there yet. Okay. Automatic silent review, this is not something that we're going to be using. User store, this is something that we actually want to grab. So this is something that I've mentioned, and for this we will, again, you can go into user manager, you can look through the settings, and you can see the type that it's specifying, right? And then you can grab this type of settings, You can grab it from here, and you can essentially initialize these settings, right? And these settings actually accept their own type of settings. So what kind of web storage mechanism do we want to be using, right? Again, I'm going to comment this out for now because we're not going to be using it. And then monitoring session, check session interval, and I think, yeah. So as far as the optional settings goes, I don't think we need anything else. Again, if we have errors, we will solve those. Next section will be the methods, and we are going to be utilizing some of them, right? So like sign in, redirect. This is the precise thing that we want. So on our login here, let's go ahead and call this user manager and sign in, redirect. There we go. And I'm going to return this because I think if I take a look at this, this is a promise. And that's pretty much it. So it's going to return this promise. It's going to hook it. I don't like just leaving promises laying about. It's like doing task run. So we're just throwing tasks into the void. So for this setup, I'm just going to go ahead and check the console so that there is nothing, no errors. Let's go back here and let's go to our application. Okay. And here we are. So the first thing that I want to do is I just want to try to log in, and we get an error, which is okay. So going to the logs of our .NET application, let's scroll up a little bit. And the real thing that I'm after is seeing this first fail. So it says invalid redirect URI, and it tells us which redirect URI. So at this point where you are getting invalid settings or something's wrong in the settings, right? What you really want to do is you want to compare these settings to the settings that you've set up here. Here you can see that we have no trailing slash. Here you can see that we have trailing slashes. So this is where we want to basically say, right, let's trim these and let's get these looking as alike as possible. Okay, so let's go ahead back down here to the end of the logs. Again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press back. I'm going to end up back here. I'm going to Control F5 just to make sure that the settings are refreshed. I'm going to click login again, and I'm going to end up on my login screen, right? It's not too impressive right now, I know, but the important thing here is to note the URL, and we're going to break this down a little bit. So it might be a little bit easier for us if we take a look at it in its form. And just as a note, this gets populated here because if we go to the login CS.html, this is where I supplied the return URL in the onGet. So you can see the parameter that it says sets here, the query parameter, return URL, and this is where we're meant to head back, okay? And I set that on the login form, and this is why it's in this hidden field now. So what is actually contained in this value? You will see that the first part really here is connect authorize. So the first thing that we redirect to is a endpoint within our identity server. So if I can remember the URL correctly, if we go here and I will do something like known open ID configuration. Oh, there we go. Right. So this is the connect authorize endpoint. So we can go ahead and grab it. Come here. Okay. Here we go. Grab this. Google this, right? Not Google, but search this page for it. But authorization endpoint. And this is the part that basically, I don't know if you can see this. So authorization endpoint. So this is the part where this is well-known information about our identity server. This is the part where you basically authorize with some kind of information to grab a code, right? So you hit this endpoint. If you're authorized, you are basically redirected back to your application with a code that you can then exchange for access tokens. So this is something well known. So to keep in mind, when we log in, we do not go back to our Nuxtjs application. When we log in, we go back to the identity server itself on this authorized endpoint, right, which is going to give us a code. If you look deeper into the URL, within here, right here, if you can see my mouse, the redirect URI then contains HTTP, localhost, 3000, and then response type code, etc. Right? So the redirect URI that is actually meant to bring us back to our application is within this URL. Okay. So we go back to the authorize endpoint. We are gonna get a code, and then we're gonna go back to our Nuxtjs application with the code, and then we'll see what happens. Okay. So I will click on the network tab. The user that is test password. Let's sign in. And this is one of the issues that I was talking about, where now that we're in the HTTP land, we're unable to authorize, right? So if you see this, like press the sign in, nothing happens, right? We've seen the login work in the previous video. I mentioned this issue. We are aware this is happening. So sometimes you just gotta use the good browser, right? So you bust out that edge. Let's go ahead and we're gonna close this, and we're gonna fall back on using Microsoft Edge for now. So localhost 3000. Let's go ahead, open this up. I'll zoom in on here a little bit. Get away from me. Okay. We're gonna log in. Same thing is gonna happen. And I think I will zoom in a little bit. And again, we have the return URL. If we inspect the form, we have it there. So let's have test password to sign in. And I will go to the network tab. I'll make sure I clear it first, and then I'm gonna sign in. And here we are, okay? And here you can see the code. So this is the code that is meant to be exchanged for tokens and user information, right? The user info endpoint, again, this is something that we're gonna take a look at, but the important thing here is you can see that we're going to account login. We get redirected to the connect authorize endpoint with the callback, and then we end up on our application, right? So we first go to the endpoint that will give us our code, which is then included in the query right here, this code, which we are now going to implement the part, which is going to exchange this code for our token and access token, okay? So let's go back into our code. We're gonna go into index.view, and here in the created, what we want to do is we want to say something along the lines of if this dot route, and I think it will actually be worth knowing what's in the route. So we don't have the extension here. So let's go ahead, cut this. We will do console.log, and we'll put the route in here to find out what the query looks like. So refreshing this, let's take a look at this. And then we have the query object where we have the code, scope, session state, and state. Okay, so these are the things that we want to extract from here. So let's go ahead. I will just copy this real quick, and I'll put this here. And the things that I want to remove is the code, the scope, and this. I really just want the names of these parameters, right? So I'm just expecting those to be here. So what I want to do is I want to extract these. So const equals route query, right? And these are the things that I'm going to be extracting. Session state and state. Okay. And what I'm going to do, if code and scope and session state and state, right? So we have all of these, we're good to go. So what I want to do is for this user manager, I want to go ahead and look for callback somewhere in here and sign in, redirect, callback. So when we log in, we issue sign in redirect. So we sign in by redirecting, and then sign in redirect callback, something that happens after we finish. Okay, so this is where we are going to initiate this, and sign in redirect callback is going to take care of of extracting stuff from the query the way that we just did and processing it, right? So let's go ahead, save this, pop back here, and Now what should happen if I refresh the page, let me first clear this. So I'll give it a refresh and hopefully this code up here will get processed. If not, let's take a look at the console. No matching state found in storage at evaluation. Okay, so this is something that gets put into your local storage, like stuff like state and things like that, to essentially make this as secure as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the original page, right? We're going to go onto network, and we're going to actually, before we do this, because there is a callback here, we're going to have a user, and this is actually something that we can just console log user here, okay? Just so we know that it is going to indeed extract a user, and we're going to take a look at where it ends up, okay? So saving that, I'm going to go ahead and clear the console. I'm going to go ahead, click login. We're already authenticated there, so this should redirect us back to our application. And the thing that you're going to see here is we're still on this endpoint, but now if we go into the console, we can see our user is getting logged, right? So we can see we have an access token, we have an ID token, we have the profile information, like the name of the user. Sub is the user identifier. This is the user ID. We don't have a refresh token because we're not requesting it. We can, but the important information here, the important thing here is that we have the user, okay? Going back to the network tab, this is the important part. This is the things that we haven't seen before. So just gonna try to find the authorize endpoint and then the code endpoint, okay? So not the code endpoint, the part where we have the code and we return back to our application. So what happens when we return back to our application is it first loads all of our app, and then this is the part where the oidc-client library actually loads the discovery document from the identity server. So this is like standard OpenID Connect procedure, okay? It loads this document. This is the page that we have looked at. I mean, we just get JSON here. So this is that thing which basically tells it. This is the authorized endpoint. This is how it knows where to redirect when you click the login button. All the endpoints that basically our identity server has are contained with this OpenID configuration. So this initial call is how it basically discovers your identity server and knows where to call it, right? And all of these endpoints in this discovery document are the parts that when we register this add identity server and we actually add the add identity server middleware, these endpoints get registered, because how we add controllers and how we basically have to create a controller for an endpoint to exist, this internally does the same, right? It's a little bit easier there because it's just returning JSON, but nevertheless. So it knows everything about our identity server here. And then what's going to happen, so this client doesn't really matter. The important part is once we get to this token endpoint, right? So this is where if we take a look at the headers and we take a look at what's being sent in the form data, this is the code that we received in the URL, okay? So the code that we received in the URL gets attached, and this is the first time when we send the code, and the code verifier is part of the Pixie configuration that we enabled. So in our startup, if I scroll back down, this require PKC, this is what it enables. So if you've done implicit flow and stuff like that before, this is why this is where this stuff is coming from, right? So it's not just like, I mean, it is random, more or less random numbers, but like the names attached to these numbers are not random. Okay, so this stuff is added here on purpose, right? So we can we know what kind of way we're authorizing with. The code verifier and the code, this is what PKC enables us to do. And yeah, this is where we are essentially coming back from. So we are posting this to the token endpoint. Again, if we take connect/token and we preview it somewhere here, token endpoint, right? This is how it knows where to get the token from. And what we get back is our access token, and there is no profile information here, right? What is going on? So the next thing is I'm not sure what the check session is about. It's probably just like a pulse kind of thing. The next important thing is the user info endpoint. So this is the part where it actually doesn't need to send anything in the body. It just calls the user information endpoint and it retrieves that information. So this is important. If you have a lot of user information, instead of including it in the ID token, this is fetched separately. So because you have to attach your ID token to every request, it makes your request longer. That means you're sending more data over the wire, right? So it's just a little bit slower, and parsing that token is going to take longer again. So we basically separated into processes. One is to obtain the tokens, which are your identification and your authorization with the API. With identification is ID token. So if we take a look at the tokens, ID token, we have authentication. Access token is we have authorization. We don't have anything authorized yet. This is just so you know which part is covering which part. On the user information, this is the profile part. So if we take a look at the console, in here where we have the profile, these are the things extracted from here. Okay, this is the user information, and we make our ID token and access tokens lean. Just general information that we want about the user is fetched separately. Okay, now let's go ahead and handle this URL up here, right? This is not something that we want. And there are a couple of things that we can do to take care of this really properly. But what I'm gonna do as a quick fix is window location.href equals / right? And this is actually not something I want to do, right? This is old JavaScript. This is actually, I think it will force a page refresh. So what we want to do is that we actually want to go and grab the router and we want to push to a location, right? So we're just going to go to /. Okay, so that's not going to cause a refresh. That's actually just going to transfer us back to our application. So let's go ahead and give this a refresh. We're probably going to get the error of not having appropriate state. So let's go ahead back to the local host. We're going to log in. And once we get the code back and that gets processed, we are going to get redirected back to where we came from. So because we're going to be losing some of that state in terms of where we came from, because usually what we're going to do is not come back to the root URL. We're going to be coming back to some other URL. We might want to store that in local storage or something like that. But again, that's a bit of a problem for another day. Right now, this is fine. So going to our application tab, what I want to do is I want to show you where this stuff is located. So at the moment, session storage, I think, let me clear both of these, and I'm just going to log in again just to make sure that stuff is in the appropriate place. So session storage is temporary storage. So what's going to happen if I copy the URL, I'll close the browser and I'm going to open up Edge again. And let's go back to here. I'm going to open up application and session storage is gone, right? So we're essentially not authenticated anymore. We lost our authentication. This is kind of like not having persistent cookies. So what we actually want to happen is we want this, our tokens stored in the local storage. And this load user info, let's go ahead and just quickly take a look at the settings, because this is something that's already happening with that with that second call to grab the user information. I'm just going to check that this is by default set to true. So extends OpenID Connect settings, load user info, defaults to true. Okay, so it's nice to know that that defaults to true. So if you don't want to make that second call to retrieve the user information, don't include that option. But for now, we're going to take a look at the web storage settings. And I can never remember what this option was, so I'll have to refer back to the documentation where, yeah, the user store new web storage, and we want to specify the store to window.local storage, right? So let's go ahead, put this here. Okay, we will save that. Let's go ahead back to our application. And now what will happen is if we try to log in, coming back, and now our information is stored in the local storage instead of this, what's called session storage, which will be lost once we close and open, right? So let's close this. Again, we will open Edge. Let's go here. Okay, so network authentication. We're still authenticated. Awesome. Session storage, nothing's in there. Okay. So that's pretty much the quick overview of connecting. Hopefully I have covered as many parts as possible. Again, if you want a bit more information and a bit more in-depth look and maybe a little bit more bare bones look, because I know we have this whole big application here, watch my authentication series. I have the playlist link in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comment section. Don't forget to take a look at the playlist first and see if any of that can answer your questions. Other than that, I also stream on Wednesdays and Sundays. I also hold some surprise streams as well. So if you want to be up to date with the announcements, also join my Discord server where I do a couple of them. But for now, I hope I see you in my other episodes.